we almost work on these generic or typical timelines for, home inspection needs to be done in 10 days and financing needs to be done in 10 days. Like, where did these timelines come from? Because I don't feel like they're changing much as the market conditions change, which they should. I mean, financing right now is not a 2-week turnaround for the most part.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Homeownership Podcast, the real estate investing podcast for Canadians. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just getting started, you've come to the right place. If you're looking for a way to take control of your life through real estate investing, stay tuned and be sure to join us at cwho.ca, your hub for all things real estate investing in Canada.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Commonwealth Homeownership Real Estate Investing Podcast. This is Phil Wong. With me as ever is Brad Price. Hey Brad. And today I think we're going to talk all about the purchase process of real estate investing and how that all goes down. Because we think a lot of people don't actually realize, as opposed to a regular house purchase as a home buyer, how different the process can actually be. So
yeah, there's a lot of nuances that we think are important for people to realize or understand rather, before jumping in, because it gets really stressful. It can be really stressful, and I think if you just have a better idea on all the little nuances that are going to be need to be dealt with, then it can probably alleviate a lot of that stress. And it can make the process a little bit smoother, a little bit easier. But if you don't know what you're getting yourself into, then it can be quite overwhelming. And like we've seen this even through our associate program. When we're helping new investors go through the process, it can be, the question comes up: is this how it always is? Is this normal? So I think it's a good time to chat about it, Phil.
Totally. And it's funny, no matter how many times you do it, it always feels a little bit hectic all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would agree. And it's like, we were talking about it the other day as to, we almost work on these generic or typical timelines for, home inspection needs to be done in 10 days and financing needs to be done in 10 days. Like, where did these timelines come from? Because I don't feel like they're changing much as the market conditions change, which they should. I mean, financing right now is not a 2-week turnaround for the most part. I mean, it might be in some circumstances, but for the most part, in the deals that we've been working on, and I think the more property you acquire, the longer it takes because the file's bigger to review. But the timelines with the purchase and maybe your realtor team, they tend to stay fairly typical and they don't change in correlation with the timelines of the market and the rest of your power team. I mean, even the lawyers are super backed up with deals, and they're saying that, hey, we need more time to process the paperwork for a deal.
And really, as an investor, I think you actually need more time just because situations change. You might need to bring a JV on board. That might take a bit more time to go through the financing processes. So it's not a little bit more complicated than just being a regular home buyer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start with the actual representation documents? Let's talk about what representation is with when you're using a realtor. An offer to purchase, an OTP. Let's talk about an offer to purchase and how writing an offer may actually differ a bit from when you're writing it as a real estate investor from just first-time home buyer.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Just going through the terms and the conditions. I mean, those are completely different, actually. So
yeah, for sure.
But let's start with the representation agreement. So, if for those who aren't aware, when you buy a house with a realtor, they might get you to sign this at the time of purchase when you put in an offer, or at the very beginning when you first meet. But it's a legal document saying that they will represent you and have your interests front and foremost before any other client in this transaction. Right. But there are little nuances in this purchase agreement or in this representation agreement that as an investor, you might want to pay special attention to. I think like one of the ones, like, for example, is there is a time frame for this representation agreement, right? And the time frame can vary. It really is up to the realtor how long the time frame is. It could vary from, just for the length duration of this deal, all the way up till 9 months, a year, however long they want to put it, especially if they're looking for a house for you at the time. So as an investor, you might want to be very careful about the time frame that you give the realtor and how long they represent you, because within that time frame, there's also other clauses that state within this time frame, if you were to buy any other house through any other reason, the realtor is privy to a commission on that purchase, even though whether or not you use them or not.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because if you plan to purchase multiple properties in that time frame and you're unawares of that clause, and I mean sometimes it can be specific to that realtor maybe sending you that property information. If you find the property elsewhere, that may be different, but it's really important to know and clarify that before signing on with the realtor. And the other thing is that it's either going to be an exclusive representation or a non-exclusive. So therefore, if it's exclusive, well, then that's going to lead you down that path of, being responsible to pay your realtor if you're going to go and do other deals that relate to information that your realtor's provided you. So that's really important to know and understand, like you say. And then the other thing too is, you can actually add additional terms into the representation agreement with your realtor. So for example, if as an investor, you're buying a property to have, maybe it's vacant, you want to have tenants move in and rent the property. Well, before you actually take the keys, you can try and set up tenant viewings for a property. So you could put in your agreement with your realtor that realtor is actually going to work with you to show the property for prospective tenants, which is a great way to try and get a lease in place and ready to go. So as soon as you take the keys, you can literally hand them to a tenant and you can start generating revenue from the moment you take possession of a property.
Mm-hmm. That's super important. I mean, I've tried buying a new property before they do it. You have the ad online and saying, if you put a deposit, we'll promise you that you'll get in on the possession date, but that usually doesn't go over well. People get a little bit sketchy when they hand over, when they're asked to hand over money before they get to see the property. So it's super important to allow the realtor at least get in a few times before the purchase to set up some viewings for the tenant. And there's also other terms in that agreement too. And remember, these are contracts you can change at any time. So at any time you can literally just cross out a line you don't want and then give it back to the realtor, and they can make those modifications before you sign on the dotted line at the bottom. And one of the things that I not a fan of is, or I like to cross out anyway, is the realtor, a clause that says the realtor has a right to ensure that your financials are accurate or ensure that you have the resources to purchase a property. So in which case, it's saying that they have the right to ask for your financials before applying for this purchase, which is, in my opinion, A, none of their business, and B, if you're using joint venture money, it might not be yours to give, right? That information.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the financing component is it's almost a different conversation with a different power team member. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something that you work with your mortgage broker on. At the end of the day, if you've got a condition to financing subject to in your offer, well, then so be it. That's the process that you go through with your mortgage broker. I mean, realistically, at the end of the day, you can't get approved for the purchase before you even write the offer anyway, because the underwriter needs to see the offer. They need all the documentation to actually approve you for that purchase regardless. So even if you do have a down payment, that doesn't provide approval for the mortgage. So regardless, I think it's fairly redundant to say that your realtor needs to see your financials in order to purchase the property. And it's private information. It doesn't necessarily need to be provided in that regard.
Like I've been thinking about why that would be in the clause, and I can understand the intention in the sense that for, say, like a first-time home buyer who's never gone to pre-approval, who doesn't have any idea of the process, having the realtor see their financials at the beginning might actually give them at least a general sense whether or not they can even afford this house in the first place. So then it doesn't really waste the realtor's time doing all this paperwork when eventually they'll come out to nothing. But as an investor, you should have all that sorted beforehand, right? As an investor, you should at least have a pre-approval, or at least know what your range is. Hopefully it's not your first purchase, but even then, even if it is, you should at least get a pre-approval from a mortgage to know what your budget is before you dive into a purchase. So
yeah, absolutely.
So
that's
that would
a very
be
good point.
Yeah. So for an investor, that would be a moot point to have the realtor take a look at it, because as an investor, you should know better than a realtor where you stand in terms of where you buy a house. When you buy a house.
From a financial aspect. Yeah,
from a financial aspect, yeah.
So, okay, let's move on, Phil, from the representation agreement with the realtor. Let's talk more about the offer to purchase and the wording in the offer to purchase. So before we go into the wording, I just want to talk about some of the templated conditions. And this one gets me every time. So,
but before we go into that, let's talk about the difference between a term and a condition, right?
Sure.
Because there's conditions and then there's terms. So conditions are things that are required that will make or break the deal. Right? If the conditions are not met, the deal, it falls through. And simple as that. So it could be a financing condition, it could be an inspection condition, RPR, for example. Whereas a term is something that is requested, and if they agree to it, then it's great. But if they don't agree to it, it doesn't necessarily make or break the deal. We can go into those a little bit more in more detail later. But first of all, let's talk about the conditions. So go ahead, Brad.
Yeah. So this one's an interesting one, because when you look at, for example, an Alberta real estate agreement, so it has templated in there 3 conditions. One is subject to financing. The other one is subject to satisfaction of home inspection for the buyer. And the other is subject to sale of a property that you may already own. So the thing I really want to talk about is the fact that they're just templated in there, and you actually have to fill it out. You've got to put the dates in there, the time frames, to render those conditions part of the agreement. Because if you just leave them blank, that will be assumed that those conditions do not apply to the deal. So for example, if you don't fill out the financing conditions, the seller and the seller's lawyer assume that you have all of the funds to make that purchase somehow, some way. That would, if there's no other conditions, that would be an unconditional purchase, an unconditional deal. So same with the home inspection. If you don't actually fill out a date and a time that the home inspection needs to be completed by, or that you need to waive the condition by, that means that a home inspection is not required as part of that deal, for that deal to go to be waived, for the deal to go through. So I think that's really important, because people just see it written there and they go, oh, great, it's already in there for me. No, you actually have to figure out what date you want to apply to it, and then you have to fill it out in that condition to make that part of the deal.
So, I mean, 2 things that we highly recommend you at least fill out is A, the mortgage financing condition, and B, the inspection condition. Mortgage financing condition, depending on how you buy the house as an investor, if you have all cash offer, that's not really an issue. You can leave that blank. But if you do need financing from a bank, then highly recommend you fill it out, because especially nowadays with bank financing being a little bit iffy, with the new rule changes being with a higher qualifying rate, it might actually be a little bit harder than you think to get the qualifying. And then in terms of time frame, we recommend at this point, as an investor, give yourself 3 weeks to a month at the very least, just because I think the realtor will suggest something like 10 days when they put in a financing condition, or maybe 2 weeks, but it's typically not enough time, especially if you're an investor. especially if you're getting something under contract, and you might need a bit more time to maybe assign that contract or find a JV to put their name in, replace their name with yours on the contract, stuff like that. That takes time, and 2 weeks is not enough time. Right now, we talked to Kim, our broker, and the banks takes 2 weeks just to look at your file sometimes. So we'd recommend at least a month. The realtors, they might push back, or the seller, they might push back, but it's a good idea to at least discuss this with your broker first and have them back you up on that. Make sure that they're both in line with the timeframes, just so you make sure the deal actually goes through without having to extend that condition. Because once you extend that condition, once it gets to the end of the condition, then you have to extend it. The previous contract's technically null and void, and the seller could very easily say, well, that's it, that's done. Condition dates have been passed, and you haven't met it, so the contract's null and void. And if there's a backup offer, they could take that backup offer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a key component in here, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later, but the key component to what you just said is that regardless of what your realtor comes back and says to you in relationship to your 4-week request for financing, they say, well, you should only need 2 weeks. You should know your situation better and be confident and comfortable to say, no, this is the date, this is the time frame, this is you can give a reason if you like, this is the reason that I've put that time frame in there, but that's what we're sticking with, that's my offer. You don't want to end up in a position where you're being pushed to shorten a time frame that is, A, not achievable, and B, it may not work for your situation specifically. So you need to be set up for success, and by altering those dates, that can really cause issues, like you said, because if you get to the end of a 2-week period, you still don't have your financing in place for a commitment. Now you're having to go back and extend that conditions. You're putting yourself at risk of losing the deal, whereby if the seller accepts your offer with that 4-week term in there, well then, great, you've got your 4-week period. Now you're at less risk of losing the deal because you've got the time frame that you need, and the seller's already agreed to that. Mm-hmm. And you can provide a reason which might help the seller understand where you're coming from to sweeten the deal or close the deal or get the property under contract. But it's just really important that you stick to your guns.
Mm-hmm. And same goes for the inspection condition as well. And at least now it says, inspection to the satisfaction of the buyer, which is important. So as opposed to just having an inspection done. So at least now now you have to be satisfied with the inspection. But again, you're looking around 2 weeks at the very minimum, right? I mean, the last purchase we made, we set at 2 weeks, but the thing is, we couldn't even make an appointment with the inspector for, what was it? 10 days.
Week and a half.
Yeah, 10 days. So 10 days just to make an appointment with the inspector. So we only had 2 days to take a look at the report and rectify, and maybe see if there's any deficiencies in the report that may justify a price decrease on the purchase. So even 2 weeks is pushing it, but it's still doable, even in the summer months. But anything less than that, you probably won't get it done. So you don't expect a 1 week turnaround for an inspector nowadays.
Yeah, but not only that too, Phil. I mean, on the back of the home inspection, I mean, if you're buying an existing property, let's just say you're buying a 1970s bungalow, for example, you get the home inspection done and it comes back and there's a few items on there that need to be further explored.
Yeah, totally.
You may need more time to have a different professional or contractor come in, look at those issues and give you a price to remediate or whatever it might be. So, I mean, we're having to extend the home inspection condition simply because there's items that need to be further reviewed on that particular deal you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So that's a perfect example of, hey, we had this time frame set out. Our inspector's got so many deals that are already on his plate to inspect, and we're just making the best of the current market conditions.
Totally.
Now,
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, had we have put 3 weeks in there, maybe we would have been in line with what's actually required to get the proper inspections done. And this is just part of the due diligence process as well. I mean, we're in a situation whereby we know already that our financing date is further out than our home inspection date. So therefore, it's not really a big deal to ask for an extension on the home inspection because it's not the last condition to be waived.
Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, the previous deal, that's a good example. There was two major items that needed further assessing, and we needed to bring in other contractors to come in to basically get a quote to see how much it would cost to remediate those or fix those two items. And yeah, so then that way, what we can do is we can take those costs, bring it to the seller, and then maybe renegotiate the purchase price, just because we know what. Now we have a solid number to give the seller to justify the price decrease, as opposed to just throwing something out there which may not hold water. So it's important to make sure you do your full due diligence and make sure you get good numbers, a good rationale for why you want a price decrease. If it comes to that.
Absolutely, yeah, because it's a lot easier to negotiate based on some reasonable evidence rather than just an arbitrary number that's plucked out of the sky. You're going to have better luck presenting something to your realtor that can be passed along to the seller to say, look, these are the things that we've found that need to be acted upon right away. And these actually may be a deal breaker for us as the buyer. Now, the other component to that is that, don't forget, the seller's already agreed to our conditions in the original OTP. So the sellers agreed to those timeframes already. Now, we're going to be 3 weeks down the road, and as a seller, you've got to weigh up the costs of holding a property or having to go back through the whole sale process versus agreeing on a slight price reduction to still close the deal and sell it in the time frame that you've already agreed upon.
I mean, really, the time is money for them as well, right? Every month they hold the properties, every month they have to pay the mortgage. So.
Exactly. So, but I think as investors, we also can be reasonable with our approach. We can understand their position. We can also understand our position that there are going to be costs that are going to be incurred to fix some of these issues. And you know what? I find that in these situations, for the most part, sellers are typically very reasonable once you can provide them with some information from an inspection report to say, look, these are quite real issues. We need to deal with these somehow, and this is our offer. We want a price reduction of X amount of dollars, and we'll waive the home inspection. So I think there's some good tips in there on actually just the simple fact that you can actually negotiate on the back of a home inspection. But you really want to do your due diligence. You want to understand what you constitute as a make or break for the deal, and what is a cosmetic issue that is not a make or break for the deal. And I think you have to be very clear on that before you go back in to renegotiate on the back of a home inspection.
Like what, basically, because there's a lot of the home inspection will come up with a lot of issues that may require maintenance, but may not be a integrity issue for the home, right? So, but if you look at stuff like that would constitute an integrity issue for the home is maybe the furnace is about to break. There's a leak in the roof. There is a grading issue with the lot where the water is seeping into flowing towards the house, and those are major issues that may actually cause issues to the home. Whereas something like the shower door doesn't close properly, or the toilet is loose on its bearings or something like that. Those are minor maintenance issues that don't negatively affect the home. May down the road, but it's something you can deal with for minor amounts of money. Whereas something like a grading issue or the furnace is about to go because it's on its last legs, those are major costs that may that will affect the price of the home, just because those are basically immediate maintenance issues that you need to deal with. Otherwise, it can negatively affect the value and the structural integrity of the home. So,
yeah, and one thing I would say too is if you're finding things that need to be further explored, or you need to get a better understanding of the price associated with fixing things that have been identified in a home inspection, get a contractor to go and have a look at it for you and give you a price. Never, unless your realtor is a contractor as well, I would highly recommend that you go with the contractor's estimate rather than a realtor's estimate on what they think construction work is going to cost to do on that home, because the contractors should have better experience and be able to provide you a more accurate cost estimation.
Totally. And it's much more powerful when you go back to the seller with an actual printed invoice from the, with a printed estimate from the contractor saying, this is how much it's going to cost to fix this problem. And another two issues, mold and asbestos. Those are huge. So if there's any risk of mold or asbestos in the home, you really need to get that looked into, because it could cost tens of thousands of dollars to remediate, and that could really make or break the deal. So
yeah, absolutely. And those two, well, one of those issues can actually grow and become a lot worse if it's not dealt with right away. So and the other is good to know where you stand for sure. So Phil, let's talk more about terms now.
Okay, well, I mean, let's cover the third condition, which is
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the condition of having to sell your current home before the deal goes through. In which case, if you're an investor, not really an issue. I mean, I'm assuming that you're just buying this as an investment, you're not buying it to live in. So you can usually leave that blank. But however, as a first-time home buyer, that might be an issue. You might do have that as a requirement to sell your current home before you can go through with the purchase of the next home. So, but yeah, let's move on to terms. So remember, terms are things that nice to have, be good to incorporate into the deal, but if it doesn't go through, it won't make or break the deal. So Brad, let's go through some examples.
Yeah, okay. So as an investor, the number one term I like to put in my deals is that, and this is the specific wording I use, the buyer may unilaterally sell or assign this purchase agreement or this offer to purchase. And it's worded like that simply because the word unilaterally means, well, one, me on my own. I don't need permission from the seller or a realtor or anybody else. I can simply either sell that purchase agreement or I can assign it to somebody else. That is crucially important or critically important to any purchase you're doing as an investor, especially if you're looking to do a joint venture with a venture partner. Because as an investor, as we acquire more and more properties, financing gets more and more difficult. And sometimes you can get to the point where your broker might say, look, I can't get you financing right now. It's not going to work. You need to find somebody else to work with that can acquire or leverage financing from the bank. So by having this term in the agreement, it can simply allow you to change the name on the contract, on the purchase agreement, to somebody else's name, so that they can apply for the financing and that you can still close on the property and pick up the keys. So that is first and foremost my number one term. And let's be clear on this. I've had situations where I've sent my list of terms and conditions and all the dates and everything that I wanted in an offer to my realtor, and the purchase agreement has come back to me to sign, and the wording is not the same. The wording is not the same. So I've read through before signing. Never ever just sign. You've got to review your documentation. Before signing, I've reviewed and gone back to my realtor and said, hey, can you please change the wording to match the way that I wrote it in my email to you? And oh yeah, okay, no problem. And they'll change it and send it back. It's very, very important, because if the wording is not correct, that could actually alter your ability to do what it is that you need to do or want to do to close the deal. Okay, so some of the other terms, access to the property 24 hours prior to possession, just to ensure that all is as it should be. Access to the property, and typically you might specify a number of times. So access to the property maybe 3 or 4 times prior to possession. And this is an important one if you're wanting to show the property to prospective tenants, or you want your realtor to go in there and show the property, or you want contractors to come in and actually do some quotations for, maybe you're going to do some small renovations or an addition or something like that. So you might want to do measure ups and you might want to do some counts on light fixtures or measure up some new kitchen cabinets or something like that. So access to the property is crucial. Access to show tenants, the assignment term, and they're really my big ones. And another one is that depending on the age of the property, sometimes I'll add in that the seller warrants no undisclosed defects as well. Sometimes I'll add that one in if I feel that I think it's necessary. If there's work that's been done on the house that you can tell that it has not been done by a contractor, sometimes it's a good time to add that term into your offer.
Mm-hmm. And one more I'd like to add is the RPR as well. To have that.
Yeah, this one is, there is actually, it's funny you say this because there is actually wording in, it's actually right underneath the term section, but there is specific wording related to the RPR, that the RPR needs to be essentially up to date and correct. But this is a good one, Phil. We should talk about this because on our latest purchase, there was an RPR that dated back to 2003, and the sellers were of the opinion that it was fine, it didn't need to be updated. And it was funny too, because there was a little bit of conversation with that realtor that was along the lines of, well, there used to be a shed or a garage there, but they got rid of it and everything's going to be fine. So the seller didn't want to pay for a new RPR. So we did not accept that. Although what we did do was we said, okay, we'll accept that. However, we're going to add a condition into the deal that states this offer is subject to the buyer's lawyer's approval of the RPR. And the moment that our realtor went back and said that they're actually going to add a condition into the offer based on the fact that they were not going to provide new RPR, the seller agreed instantaneously to provide an updated RPR. So yeah, I think that's a good point to make.
Well, I mean, I feel like that term is more the sellers. Oftentimes they would, either no RPR or as a term, or they will agree to pay for title insurance. It's the other thing that they in lieu of an RPR. And that's actually very common out east, apparently. Out in Ontario, they don't really do RPRs out there. They always do title insurance. And what title insurance does is it warrants any undisclosed issues with the title. There may be permit issues or undisclosed defects on the property. So it kind of protects the buyer in that sense, that there's any unknowns based on lack of permits or whatever, that the buyer's protected. But out west here, we prefer the RPR because RPR is almost like a guarantee that what is on the property is actually on the property, and what's not on the property is not on the property. So if there's any discrepancies between what you see and what you get on the RPR, then you know for sure that needs to be addressed. Whereas with title insurance, there's a lot of unknowns. It's basically covering the unknowns. For some people it might be good enough. But I personally prefer the RPR.
Yeah, and the RPR it's a very simple survey of the buildings on the land. So it won't actually go into detail in regards to, unpermitted work that's being done inside the property. So that's something else that's separate that needs to be looked at, reviewed, talked about, and that sort of thing should come up in a home inspection. Sometimes, I've seen home inspections come back that says that work is amateurish. Literally, they use the word amateurish, and a professional contractor should review, or use of professional contractor is not evident. I've seen that wording as well. So those things actually won't show up on an RPR. What an RPR will show you, though, is if there is an additional section of building that has been added to the land that's not in compliance with the city bylaws or is not being permitted. So it should give you a good indication if there's an issue. And if a seller doesn't want to purchase a new one, definitely review that with your realtor and maybe your lawyer to ensure that you know how to deal with it. Because like our particular case, we were not going to accept an RPR from 2003. Just
No.
quite simply, it was going to be a deal breaker for us.
And I mean, the cost of an RPR, just to give you an idea, it's around between $600 to $1,000, depending on who you call. So it's not the cheapest thing, but it's also not that much money for a $400,000 purchase. And like something to make or break the deal. So it's really up to the seller, and it's the seller's responsibility as well. So it comes down to them. And if they don't want to get an RPR, that's also something. There might be some questions about whether everything on the property is legit.
Yeah, well, it does raise concern, doesn't it?
I think that more or less covers the terms and conditions of the purchase.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about the actual process now? From imagine like an organizational chart. Imagine like an org chart, and you put yourself at the top of this org chart. Okay, you're the boss up here, and you're running this business, which is purchasing this property. Okay, so you've got yourself, you've got your realtor, you've got your mortgage broker, you've got your lawyer, you've got your home inspector, and then for us, we've got our bookkeeper and our accountant. Okay. Yeah. So these are all our team members. Is there anyone? Am I missing anyone?
There's other people like property managers and all that stuff too. But
yeah, we'll keep it simple. More to the purchase, right?
Totally.
Right. Yeah. So okay. So the first one, the realtor. We've talked about the realtor and the process there. So you're gonna go through the engagement process, the representation. We've talked about a little bit about the mortgage broker, but in essence, where I'm really kind of heading here is the fact that you actually have to provide direction to all of your team members to close the deal. And I think this is probably the biggest learning curve for people, is that once you've done that first bit with the realtor and the offer's in and accepted, that the realtors, they've done their job at that point in time. So there may be a couple other things that they need to keep working with you on. However, it's not the realtor's responsibility to organize the home inspection. It's not the realtor's responsibility to send all the documents to your mortgage broker. You're the one that has to now say, okay, what are the next steps? Oh, the insurance broker. Did I say insurance?
Oh, no, you did not say insurance. No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Pretty cool. I knew I left something out.
I'm gonna forget all that. I'm gonna forgotten a couple of times until like last minute. You're like, oh shit.
Yeah, that's true actually. So now you're in this position where, okay, great, you've got an offer accepted. What's next? Well, the next thing that you have to do is you've got to get all of those documents to your mortgage broker. Okay. You also have to get all those documents to your lawyer for them to start a file, and you've got to get them to your insurance broker and get an application from your broker to look to get a policy in place for your property. And you also have to get those files ready for your bookkeeper, so that your bookkeeper can set up your next asset within your books, so that you can properly track all of the expenses, income and expenses from day one. Even from the home inspection costs, they need to be allocated against that property. So that is the next step, is that you really need to take control of the situation and make sure that everyone on your team is doing what they need to be doing to help you close that deal on time.
So yeah, as soon as you sign that purchase agreement, it's hustle time. Basically, once you get that accepted, email your email your lawyer, email your mortgage broker, and your mortgage broker will send you a whole list of things you got to send them too. So now you're hustling to get all those things together. And then you got your insurance broker who sends you an agreement to fill out. And there's a lot of information on that insurance agreement you actually might not know, and you might not, like for example, the amperage of the electrical box, the age of the furnace, the age of the roof, all those little things you actually might not have information on until you get to the point where you do the home inspection. Because sometimes the owner may not know either, or they may not be able to get you the information for whatever reason. So then you have to wait until you get the home inspection, and then you submit that insurance document. Yeah, and then if it comes down to then you got to make sure the inspector, and once you have that done, you might have to hire contractors to get quotes for things to be done. So you're really hustling in those 2 or 3 weeks, and it can feel very hectic. And no matter how many deals you kind of do, it's always the same steps, right? It's always the same thing. So you're always hustling. It always feels hectic every time you submit the purchase agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. It doesn't seem to get any better. But I think one of the other things that we need to touch on is the insurance information is critical. So it's a really good idea to know what you need to look for before you're asking for that application. So for example, if you can get that application form, review it and go, okay, I need to get what type of plumbing pipe is in there, the amperage of the main switch, like you said, on the electrical panel, the age of the roof. You can actually take that form or just put together a list of those things that you don't yet know. And when you meet with your home inspector, you can actually ask him for that information, or just say to them, hey, can you make sure you get this information for me, so that you can accurately submit an application to your insurance broker. Because that way, if an insurance company is going to write a policy for you with unknowns, that's going to do one thing to your premium. It's going to increase the cost.
Or if you provide them false information and there's a claim and they find out the information is not accurate, they could cancel that claim.
That too. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it's critical to ensure that you are providing the correct information, but you're also setting your team up for success. So you really need to make sure that you know what to give people, you know what to ask for, and you understand the next steps once you're making that offer and it gets accepted.
And I guess once all that is sorted, once all the conditions are lifted, so once your financing is good, your inspection's good, everything's sorted, you agree on a final price if you need to renegotiate, then all comes down to a lawyer. And the insurance bit is kind of, that usually comes after everything's been done, right? After all the conditions have been lifted. So you have a couple of weeks for the insurance to kind of come through. And then so you make sure, so because I've had days where the insurance shows up, the insurance binder letter shows up the morning I'm meeting with the lawyers, which is not ideal. It's super stressful. No. But if you want to get that earlier, and then so everything has to be sorted by the time it gets to the lawyers, because if there's anything missing when you go to the lawyers, either a mortgage agreement from the bank or anything like that, then the deal gets held up. And at that point, it is, 3% interest calculated daily on the purchase price of the home for every day that it's late past the closing date. So if you don't have all your paperwork sorted by the time you get to lawyers, it can cost you a lot of money on a daily basis for every day that deal gets delayed.
Yeah, and so just one other thing I want to actually talk about is when you're going through that purchase process, and the first thing is you write an offer. So now you have one document, that is your offer to purchase. Now, if there's any negotiations or price changes or name changes, you may end up with another offer to purchase. Now, once that's finally agreed upon, the next thing that you may end up with is a waiver or a notice. You might end up with a waiver based on the fact that the home inspection is okay. So now you have 3 documents. The next one is the financing condition. If you're going to waive that condition, then now you have 4 documents. If you're going to change the name on the purchase contract or do an amendment, so you're going to take your name off, put somebody else's name on because you've got your term in there that allows you to assign that agreement. Now you have 5 documents. All of those documents make up the offer to purchase agreement. They essentially become one document, and they need to be provided to your mortgage broker for the underwriter to be able to actually underwrite the deal. They need to be provided to your lawyer or the lawyer to underwrite the deal. If any of those documents are missing, that will hold up the deal. So it's very important from day one. You need to create a document storage or file storage system or process for yourself to house all of these documents so that you can quickly and easily give them to the parties that require them, but they have to be complete.
And a private, I was to quickly touch on private purchases as well. because I mean, as a real estate investor, you might come across a deal where it doesn't involve a realtor, right? It might just be you and the seller, as you as the purchaser, and then you dealing with directly with the seller to do all this documents. But the only difference between all that is instead of the realtor filling out all the, so there won't be a realtor agreement, realtor representation agreement. That'll be a different, but everything else is more or less the same. The only difference is now you're the one filling out all the paperwork for the purchase agreement, for the offer to purchase, the terms and conditions. You're the one doing all that work yourself. So the realtor, you won't be telling a realtor to fill that information. So the importance of knowing what terms and conditions to put in the purchase contract is super important for you as an investor, because you might be the ones filling in those terms and conditions. So making sure the wording is correct. And then again, if there's any conditions that are done, then you have to make sure that there's a revision to the contract and those are added as well. So having, so you have to be sure to know all the paperwork yourself as well, not just relying on a realtor 100% of the time, especially once you get more seasoned and get a couple more deals under your belt.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to make, because when you're actually going through that process on a private sale, the banks will review those documents in even greater detail than they would with a typical deal. And they already are going into a great amount of detail on a typical deal. So they'll really want to make sure that the price range is really right in that comparables for the market at that time, to ensure there's nothing underhand or untoward going on with that purchase. So private deals can be a little more stressful as well from a financing perspective if you're going with a typical lender. And even just from, in Alberta, from a investment property purchase perspective, lenders these days are always requiring appraisals to be done on those properties. So that leads us down another path as well, because they have to book the appraisal. It has to be an approved appraiser. It has to go through their system. You can't just go and order your own appraisal. So, you have to be aware that if an appraisal comes back and it does not match your purchase price value, that you could be on the hook for more down payment to cover that shortfall as well in your deal. So it's also important to understand that part of the process. And, if you're using your last penny already for your down payment, you could be in a precarious position if you need to come up with an extra, $20,000 to ensure the deal goes through.
I mean, this is speaking of that, I think this is very pertinent in, say, if you're doing a rent to own, right? So rent to owns at the end of the term between the tenant buyer and the investor, it's typically a private sale. There's usually no realtors involved, but that's also when there might be a price discrepancy between what you're asking the tenant buyer to pay versus what it might actually be worth, especially if the market's been flat and there's a 3% markup on the contract on a yearly basis for the purchase of the price of the property, but say the market's only gone up by 1% over that time. So now there's a 4%, 2% a year, 4% discrepancy in the price between what it's actually worth, what the banks appraise it for, and what you have on the contract for the tenant buyer to purchase it at. And that 4%, which could amount to tens of thousands, depending on the price of the property, it's either you sell it to the realtor, sell it to your tenant buyer at the cost that the banks appraise it at, because that's how much mortgage they'll give, or the tenant buyer has to make up for that difference, or meet somewhere in between. So that's also, I've run into that issue in the past, and that's not fun.
Yeah, well, I almost could go down a rabbit hole.
But yeah, that's another story.
And ways to kind of do your best to mitigate it by trying to set your tenant buyer up with higher option money payments every month, to end up in a position whereby they can either utilize a 5% down payment in the end, but they were shooting for a 10% down payment, so they've got a bit of room to move, 5% room to move in there. But anyway, that's a conversation for another another day. So, but I think, you know, I really hope that this conversation is going to help people understand the nuances of the back and forth of the purchase process as an investor on just an existing residential home these days, because it can be overwhelming, it can be hectic, it's fast paced, and you know, one of the biggest things that comes to mind for me is just knowing what you're trying to do and being clear on it, on what it is you're trying to achieve. Know all the specifics, the details, and stick to your guns with your team. There's nothing wrong with you know, taking advice and recommendations, but you've got to make sure that in the decisions that you make, that it's in line with what it is that you're trying to achieve and the outcome that you want from the purchase.
You know, your power team members may have your best interests at heart, but they don't know your full situation. So you have to be the boss. You have to be the one steering the whole ship. And before we go, I just want to quickly mention on the purchase process with new builds, because that's what I typically do is new builds. And the purchase process is actually a little bit different. There are still, you know, you get the purchase contract, it'll look completely different because every builder has their own purchase contract than than the area contract that you do with realtors. And they typically don't, yeah, and you won't be dealing with the realtor because you'll be buying directly from the builder. Although a builder can bring you to the builder, and then the builder is required to pay the realtor a certain fee. That being said, though, if you do come to a builder without a realtor, you might be able to negotiate a lower price based on that, because the builders won't have to pay the fee to the realtor. So then you have a little bit of wiggle room there. But the purchase contract is very similar, but they won't. A lot of it's already set out, and they won't really make you. I mean, the financing agreements is for sure that'll be in. The inspection agreement is a you can take it or leave it depending on how much you trust the builder and how much you trust their work. It's not a bad idea to have, you know, if you're not familiar with the builder and their product. So you can still have the inspection agreement in there. You can still have the purchase agreement, the financing agreement in there. The rest will more or less be provided. Like the RPR is a given. The builders will cover the cost of that because that's just part of the building agreement. They will not let you in, likely, before the house is built due to liability issues, because it's a construction site. It's not a fully built house. So if you're looking to rent that out early, and maybe a little bit more difficult to get the builder, they might be willing to show the property to prospective tenants, but that's up to the builder. Because again, liability, because it is a live construction site. It is not a house. But the rest of it is actually quite simple. The nice thing is the builders actually take care of a lot of the organization for you, right? Once you give them you give them the information of the mortgage broker, you give them the information of the lawyer, and once that purchase contract is signed by you, they will actually coordinate the sending of that document to all your power team members. So so
you just have to work with your mortgage broker on your actual finance component of it, and then do your lawyer signing and pick up the keys. It is such a less of I guess an overwhelming feeling going through that process rather than the existing property. Yeah,
because then your mortgage broker or your bank will set up the appraisal, but then since there's no house on a piece of dirt, they will actually just do based on the plans, and they'll do if it's a rental, then they'll do a rental assessment study, right? So then all that, there's no you don't have to coordinate as many people, because that's all kind of done in the background by your power team members. And then you still have to arrange your insurance, so don't forget that. But that won't be happening until closer to the closing date, whenever that the bill is done. So your builders will typically send you like a 30-day letter saying, like, you know, the bill is done on this date, right? And then you'll do a walkthrough as well. You'll do a walkthrough with the builder, noting all the deficiencies, and you'll green tape everything, and then they'll come and fix it. So that's why I've never actually done an inspection on a new property, just because I haven't had to, and really haven't really had any issues with that. And because it's non-invasive anyway, like a lot of things that would be an issue, the inspector won't be able to see anyhow. So you have to be sure during the building process to make sure you may swing by every now and then to make sure that the construction is going well, because you're allowed to do that as well. You're allowed to pick up the keys from the builder and inspect the home at any time during the construction process, as long as you let them know ahead of time to have them clear the site, so then there's not a hazard for you to go in there.
Yeah, one thing that we haven't mentioned but applies to both strategies is the utilities. Make sure you set up, make sure you get your utilities set up for possession day in both cases. So,
yes.
especially if it's in winter, you don't want your gas throttled back or your electrical throttled back to, cause any issues. But make sure you get your utilities set up.
No, that's a good point. I've forgotten that once, and on one of the bills, and I totally forgot to switch over the utilities. And actually, they charged me a lot of money to reconnect the utilities if it ever gets switched off, because now they need to send someone back out to actually switch it back on physically, because they had done that. They had to send someone out to actually close off utilities. So that was an extra $100+ charge. So something to remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Phil, is there anything else that you think we should mention here? I think we've covered the purchase process pretty well.
Let's do a quick recap. I mean, for the purchase agreement, make sure your the real buyer's representation. If you're an investor, ideally have a non-exclusive agreement, just because you're not tied down that way. If you want to make another purchase outside of that particular agreement. Make sure that your terms and conditions are correct. Make sure your financing condition, your inspection condition is good. Your terms, have the allowing the realtor to be able to access the property, having you allowed to access the property several times before the possession date. Make sure the RPR is up to date and don't accept anything less. And there's a couple terms. Your assignment. Sorry, that's super important. Yes.
Make sure that's in there.
Yeah. You're allowed to unilaterally assign a name to another individual.
Yeah. And then just make sure that your team is in place. They know the deal's coming. That's a big one, I think. Mm-hmm. Just inform everybody that, hey, I'm making a purchase here, and I'll send you the information once I have it, but I'm just letting you know, giving you a heads up, it's coming down the pipe. So I think that's a good one too, especially with, in the summertime, with people being on holidays or vacation. If you're sending an email and you're expecting a response and somebody's away and you're thinking, yeah, they haven't gotten back to me yet, and it's been a week, you need to make sure ahead of time that they're going to be there and available to close your deal for you. So let your team know, and then just, be aware that you've got to manage that from start to finish.
Mm-hmm. And stick to your guns, stick to your time frames, because you know your situation better than anybody else. So don't let yourself be bullied around or bossed around by your team members, because they might not know your situation. They might not know what you have planned for the property. So keep in mind.
Awesome. Well, good luck, guys. Good luck on your next purchase, and hopefully this helps.
Yeah. And thanks for listening, guys. Talk to you soon.
See you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Commonwealth Homeownership Podcast. Be sure to check out all of our past episodes and our ever-growing library of content at cwho.ca. Until next time, remember to get out there, take action, and create a life of wealth by design.